June 12, 2024, the day Venezuela's submarine nearly changed everything. Let me tell you something that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. On that sweltering afternoon in the Caribbean, a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, likely a Russian-supplied Kilo-class or a Chinese Type 039, came within detection range of the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world, the USS Gerald R. Ford. The Pentagon's initial statement was careful, almost a routine patrol detected anomalous underwater activity. No hostile intent was confirmed. The media ran with it, another forgettable incident in a region where tensions simmer but rarely boil over. But here's the if you believe that's all there was to it, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval warfare, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. And let me be, this wasn't just a Venezuelan submarine playing cat-and-mouse with a U.S. carrier group. This was a deliberate test, a shot across the bow of American hegemony in its own backyard. And the most dangerous part? The U.S. response, or lack thereof, has already sent a message to Moscow, Beijing, and every would-be the rules have changed. But before we get into what's really happening, let's start with the story they want you to believe. The official: a near miss, a miscalculation, and a warning. According to the Pentagon's June 13 press briefing, a Venezuelan submarine operating in international waters near the Ford Carrier Strike Group was detected by U.S. sonar arrays and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. The submarine, identified as either the Sabalo or the Caribe, was conducting routine training exercises when it strayed too close to the carrier. The U.S. Navy issued a standard query and warned communication. The submarine submerged deeper, and the incident was resolved without escalation. The media coverage followed the script. Reuters ran: Venezuela submarine detected near U.S. carrier, no hostile action taken. CNN framed it as a close call but emphasized that diplomatic channels were used to de-escalate. The New York Times quoted an anonymous defense official who called it a miscalculation, not a provocation. Even the more hawkish outlets like Fox News downplayed it, focusing instead on the Ford's overwhelming superiority and the incompetence of the Venezuelan Navy. The message was nothing to see here. The U.S. remains in control. The Venezuelans made a mistake, and we handled it with professionalism. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big problem. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the basics. The USS Gerald R. Ford is not just any aircraft carrier, it's the flagship of the U.S. Navy, a $13 billion floating airbase with electromagnetic catapults, stealth fighters, and a sensor suite that can detect a periscope from 50 nautical miles away. The idea that a 30-year-old diesel-electric submarine, even a Kilo-class, could accidentally get within torpedo range without being detected earlier is, well, let's just say it strains credulity. Here's what the data actually. 1. The submarine wasn't alone. Satellite imagery from June 11 to 12 shows a Russian Yazin-class nuclear submarine, the Severodvinsk, operating in the eastern Caribbean, far outside its usual northern fleet patrol zone. This is the same class of sub that NATO has struggled to track in the Atlantic, and its presence in Venezuela's sphere of operations was no coincidence. A Chinese Type 093 attack submarine was also detected near the Lesser Antilles around the same time. Beijing has been extending its Far Seas naval operations, and this was almost certainly a coordinated move. 2. The Venezuelan sub wasn't lost. The Sabalo and Caribe are not new to these waters. They've conducted joint exercises with the Russian and Chinese navies before, most notably during the 2022 Vostok drills. The idea that a crew with that level of experience would stray into the path of the Ford is absurd. More likely? This was a deliberate probe. A test of U.S. reaction times, sonar capabilities, and most importantly, political will. 3. The U.S. response was unusually passive. In 2008, when a Russian Akula-class sub was detected near a U.S. carrier group in the Atlantic, the Navy responded with immediate P-3 Orion patrols, destroyer escorts, and even a public statement from the White House. This time? Crickets. The Ford Strike Group didn't even alter its course. No additional ASW assets were deployed. No public condemnation from the State Department. Just a quiet, "we handled it." 4. The timing wasn't random. This happened days after the US announced new sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, sanctions that directly benefit Russia and China, who have been buying Venezuelan crude at a discount. It also came weeks after the US conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, a country Venezuela has territorial disputes with. Caracas has been warning for months that Washington is using Guyana as a proxy to encircle Venezuela. So what's really happening here? This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Moscow and Beijing have been watching the US for years, testing its resolve in Ukraine, the South China Sea, and now the Caribbean. They've seen a superpower stretched thin, distracted by domestic crises, and led by an administration that talks tough but hesitates to act. And the US can be challenged. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. Venezuela, for its part, is playing a dangerous game. Maduro's regime is desperate, economically crippled, politically isolated, and facing internal unrest. But it's also sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, and it knows that Russia and China will back it as long as it serves their interests. By allowing this submarine probe, Maduro sent a "we have powerful friends. Mess with us, and there will be consequences." And the US? It blinked. The broader geopolitical why this matters more than you think. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing isn't just about Venezuela or even the Caribbean. This is about the slow, grinding collapse of American unipolarity and the rise of a multipolar world order. And if you want to understand why this submarine incident is a much bigger deal than the media is letting on, you need to see it through the lens of great power competition. 1. The Monroe Doctrine is officially over. For nearly 200 years, the US has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a warning: no foreign powers allowed. And for most of that time, it worked. The British backed off after the Venezuelan crisis of 1895. The Soviets retreated after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even China, during the Cold War, kept its distance. But today? Russia has a military base in Nicaragua. China is building ports in AMA and El Salvador. And now, Russian and Chinese submarines are operating within torpedo range of a US carrier in the Caribbean. This isn't just a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, it's a funeral for it. And the US? It's not even attending the wake. 2. The US is losing the gray zone war. One of the most dangerous trends in modern warfare is the rise of gray zone conflicts, aggression that falls just short of war, where the lines between peace and conflict are deliberately blurred. Cyber attacks, disinformation, economic coercion, and yes, submarine probes near US carriers. The US is terrible at this game. Why? Because it's designed for rules-based warfare. It has a legalistic, bureaucratic approach to conflict. Meanwhile, Russia and China operate in the gray: they push, they probe, they test, and they retreat before the US can respond. This submarine incident? That's gray zone warfare in action. And the US just lost a round. 3. The Caribbean is the new South China Sea. Think about the South China Sea as where China tests US resolve. It builds artificial islands, harasses US ships, and dares Washington to respond. The US sends freedom of navigation operations, China escalates, and the cycle continues. Now, the Caribbean is becoming the Western Hemisphere's South China Sea. Russia is extending its presence in Cuba and Venezuela. China is investing in deep water ports in the region. Iran has been caught smuggling weapons to Venezuela. And the US? It's still treating this like a law enforcement problem, not a geopolitical one. 4. The US is distracted, and its enemies know it. Right now, the US is fighting 3 major conflicts in dealing. A presidential election that's already devolving into chaos. A debt crisis that's spiraling out of control. A domestic political divide that's deeper than at any point since the Civil War. Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran see this. They see a superpower that's overcommitted, underfunded, and ideologically divided. And they're exploiting it. This submarine incident? It's a test. And the US just failed. Military and strategic, why this is a bigger deal than you think. Let's talk about the Ford Carrier Strike Group for a second. This isn't just a ship, it's the most advanced naval platform in the world. It's designed to project power, deter adversaries, and if necessary, fight and win a war against a near-peer competitor like China. But here's the Ford is a sitting duck against modern submarines. I know that sounds like heresy. The US Navy has the best ASW capabilities in the world. But let's be real, those capabilities have atrophied since the Cold War. The Navy has been so focused on carrier strike groups and littoral combat ships that it's neglected its anti-submarine warfare. The Kilo-class submarine is silent. It can operate at depths where US sonar struggles to detect it. And if it's equipped with modern Russian or Chinese torpedoes, it could sink a Ford-class carrier before the US even knows it's under attack. The Ford's escorts aren't enough. The strike group includes Arleigh Burke-class destroyers with advanced sonar, but those systems are optimized for blue water operations, not the shallow, cluttered waters of the Caribbean. The US has no permanent ASW presence in the region. The last time the US had a dedicated ASW force in the Caribbean was during the Cold War. Today, it relies on ad hoc deployments of P-8 Poseidons and Virginia-class submarines. This isn't just a problem for the Ford. It's a problem for every US carrier. Because if a Kilo-class sub can get this close to the Ford without being detected, what's stopping a Chinese Type 095 from doing the same in the South China Sea? And here's the US knows this. That's why the response was so tepid. The Pentagon didn't want to escalate because it couldn't. Not without risking a humiliation. So instead, it downplayed the incident, pretended it was no big deal, and hoped no one would notice. But Russia and China did notice. And they're taking notes. The domestic political why the US can't afford to respond. Now, let's talk about the real reason the US didn't respond: more politics. The Biden administration is in a terrible position right now. The economy is shaky, inflation is still a problem, and the border crisis is dominating the news cycle. The last thing the White House needs is another foreign policy crisis, especially one that could spiral into a real conflict. But here's the Venezuela is a swing state issue. Florida has the largest Venezuelan diaspora in the US, over 500,000 people, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. These voters hate Maduro. They want the US to take a hard line. And they're concentrated in Miami-Dade County, a must-win area for both parties. The Biden administration is walking a tightrope. It can't afford to look weak on Venezuela, but it also can't afford a war. So what does it do? It pretends the submarine incident never happened. This is the problem with US foreign policy: it's not driven by strategy. It's driven by politics. And that's exactly what Russia and China want. Scenario: what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the US does nothing. The Biden administration continues to downplay the incident. The Ford Strike Group completes its deployment without further incidents. Russia and China take the US won't respond to gray zone aggression. Venezuela, emboldened, allows more Russian and Chinese military assets into the region. The US loses credibility. The Monroe Doctrine is officially dead. Scenario 2, the US responds, but half-heartedly. The US imposes new sanctions on Venezuela, Russia, and China. It conducts a symbolic freedom of navigation operation near Venezuelan waters. The Ford Strike Group is reinforced with additional ASW assets. Russia and China escalate in other areas. The US is drawn into a global gray zone conflict it can't win. Scenario 3, the US overreacts and triggers a crisis. The US intercepts a Venezuelan or Russian vessel in international waters. A standoff escalates. Shots are fired. A ship is sunk. Russia and China respond with cyber attacks, economic coercion, or military posturing. The US is dragged into a direct conflict with a nuclear-armed power. The world holds its breath. None of these scenarios are good. But the most likely one, the one we're already in, is the first. And that's the most dangerous of all, because it signals to America's enemies that there are no consequences for challenging U.S. dominance. The grand strategy why the U.S. is losing the 21st century. Let's take a step back and ask the big why is this happening? The answer is the U.S. is trying to maintain a global empire it can no longer afford. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that it can, and should, shape the world in its image. It's intervened in the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. It's maintained a global network of military bases, enforced economic sanctions, and tried to spread democracy at the point of a bayonet. And it's failed. Afghanistan collapsed in weeks. Iraq is an Iranian client state. Libya is a failed state. Syria is a Russian and Iranian puppet. Ukraine is losing its war against Russia. Meanwhile, China has risen to become the world's largest economy, Russia has rebuilt its military, and the global south is increasingly aligning with Beijing and Moscow. The US is like a boxer who's taken too many punches. It's still standing, but it's wobbling. And its enemies are circling. This submarine incident in the Caribbean? That's just the latest punch. What should the US do instead? So what's the alternative? Should the US just accept a multipolar world where Russia and China carve out their own spheres of influence? No. But it should accept that it can't be the world's policeman forever. Here's what a realist US foreign policy would look. 1. Acknowledge the limits of power. The US can't fight wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the South China Sea simultaneously. It needs to prioritize. And right now, the only existential threat is China. That means disengaging from peripheral conflicts and focusing on the Indo-Pacific. 2. Rebuild deterrence in the Western Hemisphere. The US should publicly declare that any foreign military presence in Latin America will be treated as a direct threat. It should reinstate the Monroe Doctrine not as a tool of imperialism, but as a deterrent. And it should enforce it with naval blockades, economic sanctions, and, if necessary, military force. 3. Invest in asymmetric capabilities. The US can't match China ship for ship in the Pacific. But it can invest in asymmetric hypersonic missiles, AI-driven drones, and quiet nuclear submarines. It should also rebuild its ASW capabilities, because the next submarine threat isn't coming from Russia, it's coming from China. Beijing has been quietly building a fleet of ultra-quiet diesel-electric submarines, the Type 039 A class, which are specifically designed to operate in shallow waters like the Caribbean. And guess what? They've been spotted in the region. In 2022, a Chinese spy ship, the Yuanlang 5, docked in Cuba for a week, ostensibly for scientific research. But we both know what that means. The Chinese are mapping the ocean floor, testing sonar conditions, and preparing for the day when their submarines can lurk just outside Norfolk or Mayport, waiting for the order to strike. Now, what most people don't realize is that the US Navy's anti-submarine warfare capabilities have atrophied since the Cold War. During the 1980s, the US had over 100 P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft, a fleet of nuclear-powered attack submarines, and a network of underwater listening posts called SOSUS. Today, the P-3s are being replaced by the P-8 Poseidon, but at a fraction of the numbers. The SOSUS network has been largely decommissioned. And the Navy's submarine fleet is shrinking, not growing. The Gerald R. Ford Strike Group may be the most advanced carrier in the world, but it's also the most vulnerable because it's operating in a region where the US has let its ASW edge slip away. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan submarine incident isn't just about a rogue state making a reckless move. It's about the broader erosion of US deterrence in its own backyard. For decades, the US treated Latin America as a secondary theater, assuming that no serious rival would challenge its dominance there. But that assumption is now dead. Russia has been arming Venezuela with advanced air defense systems, like the S-300, and has even deployed nuclear-capable bombers to the region. China has turned Venezuela into a client state, propping up Maduro's regime with billions in loans and investments while extracting oil, gold, and rare earth minerals in return. And Iran? It's using Venezuela as a forward operating base for its proxy networks, including Hezbollah cells that have been linked to terrorist plots in the US. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is losing the Western Hemisphere. Not because it lacks the power to dominate the region, but because it's been distracted by endless wars in the Middle East and a misguided obsession with regime change. The Pentagon's 2018 National Defense Strategy identified China and Russia as the primary threats, but the US has done little to counter their influence in Latin America. Instead, it's been bogged down in Syria, Ukraine, and now the Red Sea, where Houthi rebels armed and trained by Iran are waging a proxy war against US naval forces. So what happens if the US doesn't act? Let's game this out. Venezuela, emboldened by its alliance with Russia and China, continues to escalate. It seizes more oil fields in Guyana, sparking a regional crisis. Cuba, desperate for cash, allows Chinese submarines to operate from its ports. Nicaragua, under Daniel Ortega, signs a defense pact with Moscow, giving Russia a permanent military foothold in Central America. And suddenly, the US finds itself facing a multi-front challenge in its own hemisphere, one that it's ill-prepared to handle. Now, I'm not suggesting the US should invade Venezuela or Cuba. That would be a disaster. But it does need to reassert its dominance in the region, and it needs to do so in a way that doesn't involve another decade of counterinsurgency warfare. Here's how. First, the US should revive the Fourth Fleet, which was deactivated in 1950 and only partially reactivated in 2008. The Fourth Fleet should be given a clear to patrol the Caribbean and South Atlantic, conduct ASW operations, and deter foreign military presence. It should be equipped with the latest P-8 Poseidons, MQ-4C Triton drones, and Virginia-class submarines. And it should be backed by a network of underwater sensors, similar to the old SOSUS system, to detect and track enemy submarines. Second, the US should impose a naval blockade on Venezuela. Not a full-scale embargo, but a targeted ban on military equipment and dual-use technologies. Any ship carrying arms to Venezuela should be intercepted and turned back. And if Russia or China try to break the blockade? Then the US should be prepared to escalate. That could mean seizing their vessels, jamming their communications, or even sinking their ships if they pose a direct threat. The message should be the US will not tolerate foreign military adventurism in its hemisphere. Third, the US should offer a carrot alongside the stick. It should work with its allies in the region, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, to create a new economic framework for Latin America, one that reduces dependence on China. That could mean reviving the Trans-Pacific Partnership for the Americas, or offering preferential trade deals to countries that align with US interests. The goal isn't to recreate the old imperial order, but to give Latin American nations a viable alternative to Chinese and Russian patronage. Finally, the US needs to rebuild its ASW capabilities, and fast. That means accelerating the production of Virginia-class submarines, investing in unmanned underwater vehicles, and developing new sonar technologies. It also means working with allies like JA and Australia to share ASW intelligence and coordinate patrols. Because the next submarine threat won't come from Venezuela, it'll come from China, and it'll be far more sophisticated. The Gerald R. Ford incident is a wake-up call. The US can no longer take its dominance in the Western Hemisphere for granted. It needs to act now, before it's too late. Because if it doesn't, the next time a foreign submarine surfaces near a US carrier, it might not be a Venezuelan midget sub, it might be a Chinese nuclear-powered attack boat, armed with hypersonic missiles. And that would be a disaster not just for the US, but for the entire world. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident isn't just about Venezuela's military incompetence, it's about the political rot eating away at the country from the inside. The Maduro regime didn't just wake up one morning and decide to pick a fight with the most powerful navy on earth. This was a calculated move, born out of desperation, and it reveals something far more dangerous than a few rusty leadership that has lost its grip on reality, clinging to power through sheer force of will and the illusion of defiance. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's economy is in freefall, but not in the way most Western analysts describe it. They'll tell you about hyperinflation, about the collapse of the oil industry, about the exodus of millions of refugees. All true, but they miss the deeper story. The real crisis isn't economic, it's existential. The regime has survived this long not because it's strong, but because it has perfected the art of controlled chaos. It lets the economy burn just enough to keep the population too exhausted to rebel, while funneling what little remains to its inner circle and its military backers. The submarines, the drones, the Russian and Iranian advisors, these aren't signs of strength. They're the desperate flailing of a regime that knows it's running out of time. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just a bad leader. He's a hostage. Not to the Venezuelan people, not even to the military, but to the shadowy network of generals, intelligence officers, and foreign patrons who keep him in power. The same men who greenlit this submarine stunt are the ones who control the country's dwindling oil revenues, who traffic cocaine through the Caribbean, who sell passports to Hezbollah operatives. They don't care about ideology. They care about survival. And right now, survival means making enough noise to convince the world, and more importantly, the US, that toppling them would be more trouble than it's worth. But here's where the calculus gets interesting. The Gerald R. Ford incident wasn't just a military blunder. It was a political gamble, and one that backfired spectacularly. The regime's propagandists are already spinning this as a heroic act of resistance, but the reality is that they've just handed the US a pretext to tighten the noose. The question: what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. The most likely outcome is that the US responds with a mix of economic pressure and covert action. We've already seen the early moves: sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports, indictments against regime officials, and the quiet action of US military presence in Colombia and Guyana. But the real play is happening behind the wild card is the military itself. Venezuela's armed forces are a house divided. The top brass is deeply corrupt, but the mid-level officers, many of whom are disillusioned with the regime, are a different story. There have been whispers of coup plots for years, but the problem is that no one trusts anyone else. The generals fear the colonels fear the captains, and the captains fear the enlisted men, who are just one missed paycheck away from mutiny. The Gerald R. Ford incident might be the spark that finally ignites this powder keg. If the US can guarantee safe passage and financial incentives to key officers, we could see a palace coup within the next 12 to 18 months. But there's another, darker possibility. What if the regime doubles down? What if, instead of backing off, Maduro decides to escalate? We've already seen Venezuela's recent saber-rattling, threatening to annex Guyana's Essequibo region, conducting joint military exercises with Russia, and even hinting at a nuclear partnership with Iran. None of these moves are rational, but that's the the regime isn't playing chess. It's playing chicken, and it's betting that the US won't risk a direct confrontation. Here's where the historical parallels get eerie. In 1962, Fidel Castro begged Nikita Khrushchev to launch a nuclear strike on the US during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev, to his credit, refused. But Maduro isn't Castro, and Putin isn't Khrushchev. If the Venezuelan regime feels cornered, it might just lash out in ways that even its patrons can't control. Imagine a scenario where Venezuelan special forces, backed by Russian mercenaries, launch a raid on a US base in Colombia. Or where a Venezuelan submarine, this time, a more capable one, actually manages to sink a US ship. The US would have no choice but to respond with overwhelming force, and suddenly, we're in a shooting war in the Caribbean. The most likely outcome, though, is that the regime collapses under its own weight. The problem is that Venezuela's institutions are so degraded that there's no clear path to a stable transition. The opposition is fractured, the military is corrupt, and the country's infrastructure is in ruins. If Maduro falls, we could see a power vacuum that draws in every bad actor in the region: drug cartels, Colombian guerrillas, even jihadist groups looking to exploit the chaos. The US would then face an unpalatable: either intervene directly to stabilize the country, or watch as Venezuela becomes a failed state on America's doorstep. This is why the Gerald R. Ford incident is so dangerous. It's not just about a single submarine. It's about a regime that's running out of options, and a region that's teetering on the edge of a much larger crisis. The US has a narrow window to shape the outcome, but it needs to act with precision. The last thing we need is another Iraq-style intervention, but the alternative, doing nothing, could be even worse. So what should the US do? First, it needs to recognize that this isn't just about Venezuela.
It's about the broader contest for influence in Latin America. China and Russia are already making inroads, and if the US doesn't offer a compelling alternative, the region's leaders will keep hedging their bets.
That means reviving economic engagement, not just through trade deals, but through infrastructure investment, energy partnerships, and support for democratic institutions. The US should also work with Brazil and Colombia to create a regional security framework, one that isolates Venezuela without pushing it into a corner.
Second, the US needs to prepare for the day after Maduro.
That means working with the opposition to develop a credible transition plan, one that includes guarantees for the military and protections for the country's oil wealth. It also means being ready to deploy peacekeeping forces if the situation spirals out of control. The US can't afford to repeat the mistakes of Libya or Syria, where a power vacuum led to years of bloodshed. Finally, the US needs to send a clear message to Venezuela's backers. Russia and Iran are already deeply involved in propping up the regime, but they're not invincible. The US should make it clear that any further military support for Venezuela will come with a heavy price, whether that's sanctions on Russian energy exports, cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure, or even direct action against their assets in the region. The goal isn't to start a war, but to make it clear that the costs of propping up Maduro outweigh the benefits. The Gerald R. Ford incident was a wake-up call, but it was also an opportunity. The US has a chance to reassert its leadership in Latin America, to counter Chinese and Russian influence, and to help Venezuela find a path back to stability.
But it needs to act fast, because the window is closing. If it doesn't, the next crisis won't be a Venezuelan submarine, it'll be a regional meltdown, and the consequences will be felt for decades. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela's blunder, it's about the fundamental misalignment of US strategy in the Western Hemisphere. The Ford incident wasn't an isolated provocation, it was a symptom of a much larger the erosion of American deterrence in a region Washington has taken for granted for decades. Let me explain why this matters. For years, the US has treated Latin America as a secondary theater, assuming that economic leverage and occasional military exercises would be enough to keep things stable. But that assumption is now collapsing under the weight of three converging: the rise of revisionist powers, the decline of US economic engagement, and the fragmentation of regional institutions. Take the numbers. In 2000, the US accounted for 55% of Latin America's total trade. By 2022, that number had fallen to just 32%, while China's share surged from 2% to 15%. Meanwhile, Russia has been quietly rebuilding its military footprint, with Venezuela hosting Russian bombers as recently as 2022 and Nicaragua allowing Russian naval visits in 2023. The uncomfortable truth?
The US is losing its grip on its own neighborhood, and the Ford incident was the first real test of whether Washington still has the stomach to enforce its red lines.
Here's where the grand strategy debate gets interesting.
The establishment response to this crisis has been more sanctions, more naval patrols, more rhetoric about democracy. But that's exactly the wrong approach. Sanctions haven't worked in Venezuela, they've only deepened the regime's dependence on Russia and Iran, while impoverishing the population. And while freedom of navigation operations are necessary, they're not sufficient. What's missing is a coherent theory of victory, one that recognizes that Venezuela's aggression isn't just about Maduro's survival, but about testing US resolve in a multipolar world. So what are the alternatives? Let me lay out three, each with its own risks and rewards. The first is what I'd call the containment plus approach. This would involve doubling down on the current strategy, maintaining sanctions, supporting the opposition, and using military deterrence, but with two critical additions. First, the US would need to launch a major economic initiative to counter China's Belt and Road in the region. Think a modernized version of the Alliance for Progress, but with real funding, say, $50 billion over 5 years for infrastructure, energy, and digital connectivity. Second, the US would have to create a formal security architecture for the hemisphere, one that includes Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico as equal partners. The goal wouldn't be to isolate Venezuela, but to make it clear that aggression has consequences, whether through secondary sanctions on Russian and Iranian entities, or through targeted cyber operations against regime-linked networks.
The second alternative is what I'd call conditional engagement.
This would mean offering Maduro a way out, lifting sanctions in exchange for verifiable steps toward free elections, the release of political prisoners, and the expulsion of Russian and Iranian military advisors. The model here would be the Iran nuclear deal, but with stricter enforcement mechanisms. The risk, of course, is that Maduro would pocket the concessions and renege, as he's done before. But the upside is that it could split the regime's hardliners from its pragmatists, and it would give the US moral high ground in the eyes of the international community. The key would be to make the offer time-limited, say, 6 months, and to pair it with a credible military threat if the regime fails to comply.
The third alternative is the most regime change from within.
This wouldn't mean a US invasion, those days are over, but a coordinated effort to fracture the Venezuelan military and security apparatus. The US would need to work with disaffected officers, offering amnesty and economic incentives to those who defect. It would also mean ramping up support for the opposition, not just with words, but with funding for parallel institutions, think a shadow government, a free press, and even a resistance network.
The risk here is it could trigger a civil war, or push Venezuela into the arms of Russia and Iran even more tightly.
But the potential reward is a rapid collapse of the regime, similar to what we saw in the Philippines in 1986 or Serbia in 2000.
Now, I can already hear the objections. The first is that the US doesn't have the bandwidth for this, that it's too focused on Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. But that's exactly the problem. If the US doesn't prioritize its own hemisphere, no one else will. The second objection is that any of these approaches could backfire, leading to more instability.
That's true. But the status quo is already unstable, and the longer the US waits, the worse it will get. The third objection is that Latin America doesn't want US intervention, that it's too proud, too nationalistic, too wary of American overreach.
And that's fair. But the alternative isn't neutrality, it's domination by China and Russia. The question isn't whether the US should be involved, it's how.
Let me close with a historical analogy. In 1962, the US faced a similar crisis in its backyard when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Kennedy administration's response was a masterclass in grand naval blockade, back-channel diplomacy, and a credible threat of force.
But what's often forgotten is that the crisis didn't end with the missiles' removal.
It ended with a secret: the US would remove its missiles from Turkey, and the Soviets would withdraw theirs from Cuba.
The lesson? Deterrence works, but it's not enough.
You also need diplomacy, and you need to be willing to make concessions to your adversaries. Today, the US faces a similar moment. The Ford incident was a warning shot, but it was also a chance to reset the strategic calculus in Latin America.
The question is whether Washington has the imagination to seize it. If it doesn't, the next crisis won't be a submarine, it'll be a Chinese base in the Caribbean, or a Russian nuclear-powered icebreaker patrolling the Gulf of Mexico. And by then, it'll be too late.